The river once ran clean. It tumbled over stone teeth and smooth driftwood, curling into deep, cold pools where deer stooped to drink and catfish lounged in shadow. To the Comanche, it was not just water. It was memory. It was the breath of the old world, unbroken and patient. Then came the settlers. They arrived with wagons heavy with iron pots, glass jars, seeds from distant places that did not belong to the dry heart of Texas. Their voices clanged like rusted bells against the silence. They drove their stakes into land that bore no treaties, and they cut into the earth as if carving up the flesh of something still alive. It was not enough to till the soil or build their crooked houses from stripped cedar. They wanted dominion, not coexistence. And so they poisoned the river. It began with barrels carted from a town a day's ride east, their sides blistered with the brand of a trader known for selling remedies and pest powders. What seeped from them was not meant for insects. Men wearing wide-brimmed hats and long coats hammered open the barrels and let the river drink the bitter death within. The water dulled. Fish floated belly up. Birds dipped their beaks and fell from the sky in ragged arcs. Deer came trembling to the banks and collapsed before they could stagger away. The land sickened, and the Comanche felt it in the marrow of their bones. The council called a gathering beneath the gnarled cottonwoods. Fires hissed low, speaking in a language of ash and smoke. Elders, warriors, women who carried the old ways, all circled the flames with hollowed eyes. They spoke of retaliation, but each word felt heavy, dragged down by the invisible hand of grief. Among them sat a man younger than most, his hair still black and braided tight with strips of sinew. His name was Nakos, meaning bear, but he moved like a wolf, silent, hungry, unrelenting. He had been a scout since he could first mount a horse without falling. His eyes missed nothing. His heart burned cold and slow, not like a wildfire, but like the coals at the bottom of a long-dead fire, waiting to catch the breath of the wind. Nakos said little at the council. His voice was not needed. His task would be his answer. That night, under a gibbous moon smeared thin by cloud, he packed a small bundle. A blade honed from obsidian, a length of rope, a pouch filled with dust finer than sand but more deadly than a rattlesnake's kiss. Gifted by a medicine woman who had stitched his wounds in younger days, it was meant only for those who had crossed the line between men and beasts. He followed the poisoned river upstream, riding a piebald mustang that knew the rhythm of stealth better than any man could teach. The settlers had built their camp near a split in the river, a place where two streams braided together before falling down a shale cliff. Their fires flickered like rotten stars between the pines. Their voices carried, coarse and triumphant. Nakos watched from the trees, watched as they drank the poisoned water and laughed about how soon the land would be theirs, free of savages and vermin. Watched the children of settlers chasing each other with sticks carved into mock rifles. Watched women scrubbing clothes stained with the blood of buffalo they had slaughtered and left to rot, taking only the hides. He sat in the dark and let the hatred grow. It was not a wildfire, not yet. It was the coiled rattlesnake in the grass, patient, precise. He began with the animals, horses that had carried the settlers across the plains, sturdy and proud. Nakos moved between their tethered forms like a spirit, unseen, unheard. He left small pricks of poison at the base of their tongues, where it would be swallowed without alarm. In the morning, they would foam at the mouth, collapse into the mud. The settlers would believe it was a sickness from the land itself. Next, he found their stores of food, flour, dried beans, salted pork. With deft fingers, he worked the dust of death into their provisions. He needed no grand battles, no drawn blades. He needed only time and the sure hand of rot. Days passed, the river remained fouled, but now the camp began to turn inward. Horses died. Children fell ill, their skin blotched and their eyes wide with terror. Men grew hollowed by fever, by distrust, suspecting one another of ill luck or witchery. Nakos watched but did not strike. Not yet. A viper knows the value of the slow kill. On the fourth night, a hard rain came. It flattened the fires, drove the settlers into their cabins and under crude tents. It carried the poisons deeper into the soil, into the veins of the land. Nakos sat on a high ridge and watched the water run black. In the far distance, coyotes sang their thin, triumphant songs. When dawn came and the clouds broke open to a bruised, bleeding sky, Nakos made his move. He crept into the camp, stepping between puddles so that his scent and trail would be lost. Inside the largest of the cabins, he found the one they called Mr. Halston, the man whose coin had bought the poison. a broad, red-faced man with a gut like a loaded cart, now lying pale and shivering beneath a pile of elk hides. Nakos knelt beside him and whispered not in English, but in Comanche, words heavy with the weight of ancestors and ruined earth. "You took our river, now I take your blood, your breath, your name." Mr. Halston's eyes fluttered. He tried to speak, but his tongue was a fat, useless thing. Nakos pressed the blade of obsidian against the man's chest, not to kill him, but to mark him. A single line, shallow but enduring, from sternum to navel. "You will not die fast. You will not die clean." He left Halston there, to rot in his own stink and terror. Nakos returned to the trees, to the ghosting shadows. His work had only just begun. He would not only poison the settlers' bodies, he would poison their future. Their children, if they survived, would remember only sickness and loss. Their crops would wither, their beasts would miscarry, their water would turn to bile in their throats. Nakos vowed it as the sun split the storm-torn sky, casting long, broken shadows over the cursed land. The sickness spread faster than Nakos had dared hope. By the next moonrise, the settlers' camp was a thing of stench and confusion. Their fires smoldered unattended. Dogs, once fat and yapping, now picked through refuse with ribs standing out sharp as knives. Women wept at graves they dug with shaking hands. Men stumbled about with rifles in limp arms, firing at shadows, imagining enemies behind every tree. Nakos did not stay to gloat. He had seen death enough. Now he needed to ensure its roots sank deep. He rode northward where the last of the river's forks cut through limestone bluffs. There, the settlers had spoken of building a larger town, a place with a church, a school, and a jailhouse. Plans drawn on cracked parchment in their wagon chests, dreams that now shriveled with each heave of their poisoned lungs. Nakos found the surveyors first. They camped apart from the others, a small group of men who measured the land with chains and iron stakes, marking it as if it belonged to them by the mere act of naming it. Their leader, a man called Reddick, was known for boasting in distant towns that he would tame the savage territories before any other. His coat was stitched with brass buttons, his boots polished, his beard trimmed to a precise line. Nakos watched their camp for 2 days, studying their patterns. Reddick rose early to drink strong black coffee from a tin cup and to scribble notes into his ledger. His men drank whiskey by the fire after dark, voices slurred, pistols loose at their hips. On the third night, Nakos slipped into the camp as they slept. He did not bring poison this time. For these men, something else was needed. He found their horses first, not to kill but to set loose. He cut the hobbles and whispered to the beasts until they bolted into the dark, hooves churning mud. Then Nakos turned to the tools of conquest, the maps, the ledgers, the compasses, the iron stakes. He dragged them into a pile, doused them with lamp oil, and set them alight. The fire woke the surveyors in confusion and panic. Shouts rang out. Half-dressed men stumbled through the smoke, trying to save their instruments, their maps. Nakos circled them like a hawk, unseen but always close. When Reddick ran to the river to fill a bucket, Nakos struck. He drove the obsidian blade deep into Reddick's thigh, avoiding bone, avoiding arteries. Painful, crippling, but not fatal. Reddick fell screaming into the mud. Nakos leaned close, his breath cold against Reddick's ear. "You mark the earth," he said in Comanche, "but the earth will mark you." He left Reddick writhing there, the stink of burnt paper and blood rising around him. His men gathered him up, but Nakos knew the damage was done. Without their maps, without their horses, they were blind and trapped in a land that hated them. By the time Nakos returned to the main settlement, it was a ghost of its former self. Cabins stood empty, doors swinging loose on broken hinges. Dead livestock bloated in the sun, swarmed by flies so thick the air hummed. Those who remained were gaunt, ragged, paranoid. They spoke of curses, of angry spirits, of the land itself turning against them. Nakos saw none of his own people. They had abandoned the poisoned places, moving westward to untouched hunting grounds, leaving behind only the memory of their sorrow. It would have been easy then to disappear, to leave the settlers to their slow decay. But Nakos knew easy vengeance was no vengeance at all. He began to visit the edges of the camp at night, not to attack but to haunt. He left tokens, an arrow sunk deep into the frame of a cabin door, a smear of red handprints across wagon wheels, a string of bones tied to the lintel of the abandoned church. Each sign was a wound to their minds, deeper and more lasting than any knife could cut. Children began to wake screaming from nightmares they could not explain. Women clutched at crosses until their palms bled. Men gathered in huddled circles, muttering prayers, their rifles clutched tight, though they could no longer trust their own hands. Winter crept down from the mountains early that year, harsher than any the settlers had prepared for. Crops rotted in frozen soil, water buckets cracked apart under frost. Game grew scarce, slipping farther into the hills beyond reach. Nakos waited until desperation broke them completely. He saw them gather wagons, lash the few remaining oxen to the yokes, pack what little remained of their possessions. He saw them light torches to burn the houses they could not carry, as if fire could cleanse their failure. They would flee east, back toward the towns that had fed them lies of easy land and rich harvests. But they would carry the sickness with them, the memories of poisoned water, dead children, burned maps, and a ghost that spoke in a tongue older than the bones under their feet. Nakos watched them vanish down the river road, a tattered line of refugees. He rode the piebald Mustang through the ruins of their settlement, the smoke still curling in low, bitter threads. He did not smile. Vengeance was not joy, it was a duty. He found the river and knelt by it. The water still ran sickly, still bore the scars of their greed. Nakos touched the surface with his fingertips and whispered a vow into the current. This is not finished. There would be others, more wagons, more men with bright guns and darker ambitions, but they would find no easy conquest here. Not while the river remembered. Not while Nakos lived. The settlers who fled left more behind than broken cabins and poisoned dreams. They left trails, deep ruts carved into the earth by their fleeing wagons, discarded belongings, forgotten tools, stained linens marked with the blood of their sick. They left fear in the soil itself, a fear that traveled faster than any horse. Eastward, their stories grew distorted by fever and desperation. They spoke of devils riding the night, of a river cursed by savage witchcraft, of unseen eyes that watched from every tree. Tales wrapped in lies, but rooted in something terrible and real. New men listened. Harder men, men who had no families trailing behind them in wagons, men with pistols tucked into sashes, with whips coiled at their sides. They called themselves a militia, but Nakos knew them for what they were, carrion birds drawn by the stink of weakness. They arrived in the dead of winter, their numbers small but their weapons sharp. No settlers this time, no women with cradles, no preachers clutching leather-bound Bibles. These were soldiers in everything but name, paid by distant land barons to secure the poisoned river valley for future claims. Nakos saw them first from the ridges. Their leader, a wiry man with silver hair and a crooked jaw, wore a long blue coat and carried a saber at his belt. His name was Captain Vance, though Nakos learned it only by listening from the darkness beyond their fires. Vance spoke plainly, without the foolish boasts of the settlers. "We cut out whatever cancer took this place," he said to his men. "We burn it to the root." Nakos understood then that this fight would not be the slow decay he had nurtured before. This would be war, of a kind the river had not yet seen. He did not face them alone. When the Comanche had pulled westward, not all had gone. Some had lingered in the broken hills and the thickets near the river, too old or too proud to abandon the land entirely. Nakos found them one by one, an elder with one clouded eye who once taught him how to read the tracks of owls, a woman with scars down her arms who could snare a fish from a dry stream, a boy no older than 12 whose parents had sickened and died. They listened to Nakos, not because he spoke with fire, but because the fire burned behind his words. Together they made ready. They knew better than to meet force with force. Against rifles and sabers they would lose. Instead, they became mist, whispers, the cold breath of death along the riverbanks. On the first night they raided the militia's stores, not to steal but to spoil. They slit open flour sacks and pissed into them. They scattered dead rats among the salted meat. They laced whiskey with bitter roots that twisted the gut and blurred the mind. On the second night they trapped the militia's horses. Deep pits dug where the earth was soft, masked with reeds and dusting snow. 2 beasts broke their legs in the falls, and the cries of the animals woke the night for miles. On the third, they set fires in the eastern woods, driving smoke through the camp. Men coughed and cursed, fumbling for water, their rifles useless in the choking blackness. Vance responded with brutality. He ordered patrols. He built barricades from felled trees. He promised gold to any man who brought him a savage's scalp. But fear had already set into the bones of his men. They watched the woods with wide, sleepless eyes. They flinched at the crack of a twig, the cry of a mourning dove. Nakos pressed harder. He took trophies now, boots left by campfires, hats plucked from sleeping heads, knives vanished from sheaths. Every loss, no matter how small, was a wound. Every night the militia grew thinner, their discipline fraying. Then Nakos made his boldest move. He captured one of them. A boy barely 16, caught wandering too far from the main camp, looking for a lost horse. Nakos and the others tied him with strips of hide and left him staked to the frozen riverbank, his cries thin and brittle in the dawn air. When Vance found the boy, he found more than just a prisoner. Carved into the boy's chest, shallow but bloody, was a single word in the Comanche tongue. Vance could not read it, but the meaning was clear enough. Warning. The militia began to desert after that, small groups slipping away into the night, leaving behind empty bedrolls and trampled snow. Vance grew harder, crueler. He executed one of his own for cowardice, shot him between the eyes, and left the body to freeze where it fell. Nakos watched it all from the trees, a shadow among shadows. But Vance did not break as easily as the settlers had. He dug in, he fortified. He sent messengers east for reinforcements, for more guns, for more blood. Nakos knew he could not simply wait this time. He would have to strike the heart of the serpent. He would have to end Vance himself. The river, though poisoned and sluggish, still whispered its ancient songs to Nakos at night. Songs of justice, songs of the long hunt. He listened. He sharpened his blade. He prepared. The winter deepened around them all, a white shroud promising that only the strongest or the most ruthless would survive. Nakos intended to be both. The sky hung low and iron-gray over the river valley, as if the heavens themselves pressed down to suffocate the life remaining there. Frost clung to every limb and stone, brittle as old bone. Nakos moved through it like a hawk in slow circles, eyes fixed on his prey. Captain Vance had tightened the perimeter, but he could not seal it completely. The men left under his command were raw and worn thin by the invisible siege. Fires burned all night in their camp, desperate to push back a darkness they could no longer name. Every shadow became a threat, every gust of wind a whisper of death. Nakos watched for weaknesses and found them in the small hours before dawn, when even the hard-eyed soldiers slipped into broken sleep. Vance himself took to pacing the camp through the night, saber drawn, muttering to himself under his breath. Nakos made no attempt at mass assault. He would not raise a hand until he could crush the head of the serpent. He laid traps instead, patient and cruel. A fallen tree across the trail leading eastward, designed to delay any messenger who might slip through. Deadfalls triggered by tripwires hidden beneath the snow. Subtle signs pointing toward imaginary ambushes, drawing Vance's men farther and farther into the woods where the river ran black beneath the ice. Each trap sapped their numbers. One by one, they vanished into the frozen forest, never to return. It was not enough. Nakos needed a break, and it came in the form of a betrayal. A man named Court Anders, broad-shouldered, sallow-eyed, approached the hidden Comanche one night under the white shivering trees, his hands raised, a scrap of filthy cloth tied to a stick. He came alone. Nakos and the others circled him in silence, their breath smoking in the cold. "I don't want no part of Vance no more," Court rasped, his voice cracking from thirst and fear. "He's mad, thinks he can hold this place, thinks he can kill the land itself." Nakos said nothing, but the others watched him, waiting for his judgment. Court knelt, the frozen earth biting into his knees. "I'll help you," he said. "Just let me go when it's done. I'll leave, swear it by the bones of my mother." Nakos stepped forward, studying him. Lies were easy to speak when the gallows loomed, but there was a weight to Court's words, a trembling that no act could fake. Nakos gave a single nod. Court told them where Vance slept, an abandoned settler's cabin fortified with boards and iron nails, guarded by two men who had lost all will to fight. He told them the times Vance ate, when he left the fire, when he drank alone in the black hours before dawn. Nakos listened without speaking. Then he turned and vanished into the dark. The plan formed like ice on the river, slow but certain. At the next moonless night, when even the owls held their breath, Nakos and three others crept down from the ridge toward the camp. Court had arranged a distraction, a fire set to a line of dry pine needles far beyond the cabins. It caught fast, throwing wild light into the sky, a false sunrise that pulled the guards from their posts. Nakos reached the cabin before the alarm could rise. The door was bolted, but it was old wood, and the obsidian knife bit deep without a sound. Inside, Vance sat at a rough table, poring over a ragged map by the guttering light of a tallow candle. He looked up too late. Nakos crossed the space between them in 2 strides. He slammed Vance's hand down onto the table, pinning it with the obsidian blade through flesh and wood. The candle toppled, sputtering, throwing monstrous shadows up the walls. Vance snarled like a trapped wolf and swung his other hand for the saber at his hip. Nakos caught his wrist and twisted until the bones cracked like dry twigs. The others entered behind him, weapons ready, faces like stone masks. Vance tried to speak, to bargain, but Nakos struck him across the mouth, silencing him. "No more words," Nakos said, his voice low and cold. They dragged Vance from the cabin into the open night. Men still shouted in the distance, fighting the false fire Court had set. No one saw the captain fall. At the river's edge, where the poisoned water hissed against the ice, Nakos and his people built a scaffold of rough logs and twisted vine. A hanging tree in a place where no tree grew. They tied Vance's arms behind him, looped a rope around his throat. The captain's face twisted with rage and terror, spit foaming at the corners of his mouth. "You think you can stop it," he gasped. "More will come, more always come." Nakos leaned close so that only Vance could hear. "Let them come," he said. "The river remembers." Then he kicked the support free. Vance dropped, the rope snapping tight, jerking his body into a slow, broken dance above the frozen water. The Comanche watched until the last breath left him, until the rope ceased its creaking sway. When it was done, they cut him down and left his body sprawled on the riverbank, arms thrown wide like a man pleading to a sky that would not answer. The message was simple. This land had teeth. It would not be claimed by the greedy hands of men who saw it only as acres to be measured and sold. Nakos stood there as dawn crept over the hills, painting the world in bitter red and silver. He did not feel triumph. Only a deeper stillness inside him, a colder kind of flame. The work was not finished. It would never be finished. But here, by the poisoned river, a seed had been planted. A seed of fear, of memory, of vengeance whispered on every breeze that wound through the broken trees. The river carried it westward, eastward, into the hearts of those who would dare follow. Spring came slow and sour to the river valley. The snow receded in wet, coughing fits. Mud swallowed the charred remains of the settlers' cabins. Shoots of green struggled up from poisoned earth, thin and brittle as the bones buried beneath them. Birds returned, wary, their songs clipped and hollow. Nakos watched it all from the high bluffs. He had stayed through the thaw, long after most of his kin had pulled westward, refusing to let the valley heal without witness. His Mustang grazed nearby, shaggy and half-wild after the winter, but still tethered to him by a bond older than memory. Below, no men stirred, no new settlers came, no flags were planted. Word had spread through the territories like fire in dry grass, whispered by those who survived, twisted by those who hadn't. They spoke of a cursed river where crops died in their roots, where horses sickened, where children were born with the eyes of corpses. The land had become legend. Nakos had become a ghost. Once in late spring, a scouting party of soldiers rode to the edge of the valley, their uniforms clean, their sabers bright with new polish. Nakos watched them from the rocks, unmoving. The soldiers did not enter. They circled like wary coyotes, sniffing the wind, and turned back without setting a single boot beyond the river. Fear had rooted itself deeper than any fence post. Still, Nako's new men would not forget forever. Greed never died, only slept. He did not plan to stay a lone sentinel against the flood that would one day return. He had other work to do, blood that still cried for justice beyond the poisoned waters. But he would leave the valley with a final mark, one no settler would dare erase. He gathered what few kin remained nearby, the scarred woman, the owl-eyed elder, the boy grown harder from a winter of silent battles. They moved together through the abandoned ruins, not with destruction but with purpose. In the gutted church, they piled stones into mounds, crude and heavy, arranged not by man's measure but by the memory of the land itself. Over the graves of settlers, they planted thornbush and wild briar. The twisted roots would tear through coffins and foundations alike. They carved new totems from river stones, not with the faces of beasts or gods, but with the shapes of bones, of broken arrows, of hands raised not in prayer but in warning. At the river's highest bend, where once a trading post had been planned, Nakos dug a pit by hand, deep into the loam. He lined it with shards of poisoned iron, glass from shattered settler jars, the rusted teeth of old saws, a snare for the future. No trail would ever lead cleanly through this valley again. When the last task was done, Nakos stood atop the ridge one final time. The wind stirred the grasses in low, murmuring waves. The poisoned river flowed sluggishly below, its surface broken now and then by the dark backs of fish too stubborn or too foolish to die. The land looked asleep but not dead, wounded but not defeated. Like him, Nakos looked westward, toward the broken teeth of the mountains. He said no farewell, he left no sign. He mounted the Mustang and rode, the rhythm of hooves blending into the breath of the earth itself. Behind him, the valley remained silent, watching. Waiting. The story of the poisoned river traveled farther than Nakos ever would. Traders spoke of it in cracked whispers by frontier fires. Mapmakers left it blank on their parchments, a white scar where no settlements could grow. Fathers told their sons of the land where the dead still walked, where the Comanche still rode unseen under blood-red moons. No flags rose there. No churches tolled their bells. No fields ripened under summer suns. The river carried the memory forward. And those who thought to claim the land learned in time that some places do not forgive. Some wounds never heal. Some ghosts never leave. In the deep places of the night, when the wind bent the trees into groaning shapes and the moon painted the river with silver scars, a name would sometimes rise unbidden from the lips of the fearful and the dying. Nakos, bear her remains, and in that name a promise. The land had been poisoned once. It would never be poisoned again. Not while memory endured. Not while the river whispered its cold, endless song.